Bien, buenos días, bienvenidos a la séptima sesión del Seminario Internacional sobre la Ciencia de la Lógica de Hegel, la cual estará dedicada al capítulo La vida a cargo de la profesora Michela Bordiñón. Michela Bordiñón se doctoró en filosofía por la Universidad de Padua en 2011 con una tesis sobre la noción de contradicción en la lógica de Hegel. La versión revisada de la tesis se publicó bajo el título de El límite de la verità, el problema de la contradicción en la lógica de Hegel, y sus principales líneas de investigación se centran en la relación entre lógica formal y lógica especulativa, sobre la cual ha publicado numerosos ensayos en revistas italianas e internacionales. Actualmente es profesora en la Universidad Federal de ABC, y trabaja en un proyecto de investigación sobre Hegel y la metafísica de procesos. Después de la presentación de la profesora, como siempre, se podrá participar a través de preguntas y comentarios en la opción levantar la mano en la función reacciones. Y ahora le damos la palabra a la profesora Borriñón para que pueda dar inicio a la sesión.
We present the section, not only the section of life, because I need to say something also about the idea, which is the precondition in order to make sense of the life section. So I start reading my presentation here. I start with the idea section, which is the introductory section of this part of the logic. And Hegel starts the third section of subjective logic dedicated to the idea with an introductory chapter in which he mainly presents his notion of idea as a result of the dialectical path within subjectivity and objectivity. I quote, "The idea is the adequate concept," and here the interesting point is the word adequate, "the objectively true or the true as such," end of quote. I'm using the Di Giovanni translation, okay? As Di Giovanni notes in the English translation, when Hegel states that the idea is the adequate concept, he intentionally uses the Latin-derived word adequate to remind the reader of the classic correspondence definition of truth as adequatio rei et intellectus. However, in the case of Hegel's notion of the idea as objectively true, the relation of adequacy that Hegel has in mind is not that of thought that needs to be adequate to a given objective reality, but that of objectivity to the structure of the concept. This is exactly the result of the dialectic of teleology, in which the conformity between objectivity and subjectivity is achieved. So the problem is to make this adequacy relation clear, and I think this is one of the main aims of this introductory chapter. In fact, what we know until now is that the truth that the idea is in itself is not, of course, a property of proposition or judgment, but is something properly objective. I quote, "If anything has truth, it has it by virtue of its idea, or something has truth only insofar as it is idea," end of quote. The idea is what makes something true, a true friend, a true house, a true state, etc. And a friend, a house, a state is true insofar as each one is the idea, and in particular it is the idea of friend, house, state, etc. That is what a friend, house, state must be in order to be what they are. Nevertheless, idea is not simply the archetype of that something must realize to be what it is. But it is, I think, the same process of self-determination that something must go through to be concretely and completely what it is, namely its truth, i.e., its idea. So the idea comes out of a specifically idea dimension to which it traditionally belongs in order to assume a concrete and processual dimension. Therefore, Hegel's specification, according to which idea is not a simple mental structure, does make sense because idea has a status which is opposite to that of a simple mental representation. Idea is not true as a representation which corresponds to a state of affair. Idea is true, or is the truth, as the objectivity that conforms with the idea, or rather, that concretely and completely realizes the idea. And the idea is the same process of realization. In this sense, Hegel distinguishes the logical structure of the idea from that of teleology as an external purposiveness. In external purposiveness, the realization of objectivity is conditioned by a means which is external to it. Idea instead is unconditioned because it does not have a condition outside itself for its own realization. It is self-realization, and in this sense, the idea is the rational because it has the structure of reason, namely it is self-determination. I quote, "The idea is the rational in this sense, it is the unconditioned, because only that has condition, which essentially refers to an objectivity that it does not determine itself, but which is still stands over against it in the form of indifference and externality, just as the external purposiveness had condition." And then Hegel mentioned some observation about the difference between idea of reason and concept of the understanding that here I can skip, I think. And if you want, we can go back to discuss it during the discussion. And I want to go on with the main points of the chapter. So on the one hand, what we know about ideas is what follows. On the one hand, Hegel distinguishes his notion of the idea from the traditional one, according to which the idea is something not real. The idea is not something subjective and contingent because it is what is maximally real, since it self-determines objectively in actual reality, and therefore does not remain a prisoner of a purely mental dimension that should adapt to a given reality. And on the other hand, Hegel underlines how the idea cannot even be traced back to something transcendent with respect to experience, because once again, it is something that self-determines objectively in actual reality and does not correspond to a model belonging to a purely ideal dimension to which experience should adapt. So in this sense, it is complex but particularly important to reflect on the definition that Hegel provides of the idea as union of concept and objectivity. We need to try to understand how this union is articulated. I quote, "But since the result now is that the idea is the unity of the concept and objectivity, we must not regard it as just a goal, which is to be approximated but itself remain always a kind of beyond. We must rather regard everything as being actual only to the extent that it has the idea in it and express it. It is not just that the subject matter, the objective and the subjective word ought to be in principle congruent with the idea. The two are themselves rather the congruence of concept and reality." End of quote. So what we know then is that the idea is the truth and that it consists of a relation of unity between subjectivity and objectivity. We know that Hegel refers to the relation of adequacy, which he derives from the traditional correspondence conception of truth, but we know that this relation must be reinterpreted because, on the one hand, the idea is not a mental structure or representation that must adapt to a given state of affairs, but the idea is not even a given ideal structure to which reality as such should adapt as something external, transcendent, and therefore independent of reality itself, because such conception of idea would encounter in reality only an external mean of its realization. And if this were the case, the process of realization of the idea would replicate that of external teleology. So the relation of adequacy to which Hegel refers at the beginning of the section, and which we can take up again at this point in the analysis, is therefore entirely internal to an objectivity which has in itself the structure of self-determination. For Hegel, the subject matter, the Gegenstand, at this point in the text, is equivalent to objektive und subjektive Welt überhaupt. And it must not simply be congruent with an idea given outside of this objective and subjective world, being within a merely ideal horizon. Objectivity must be in itself the congress of concept and reality. It must have in itself the idea, which is its own process of self-determination, and it have to do that as an actual reality which determines itself for what it is in a necessary way. Objectivity in its truth is the same process of self-determination which is at the same time idea, that thus is the unity of objectivity and subjectivity. I quote, but the idea is not only the general meaning of true being, of the unity of concept and reality, but also the more particular one of unity of subjective concept and objectivity, end of quote. So in the idea, the subjective concept is no longer a structure that finds its realization in a matter external and independent of its own structure. Now the concept is no longer subjective, but it is a subjective concept that turns out to be concretely objective because it is completely immersed in objectivity. I quote, now the idea has shown itself to be the concept liberated again into its objectivity from the immediacy into which it has sunk into the object. It is the concept that distinguishes itself from its objectivity, but an objectivity which is no less determined by it and possessed by its substantiality only in that concept. This identity has therefore rightly been designed as a subject-object, for it is just as well the formal subjective concept as it is the object as such. End of quote. So the way in which the idea is the concept immersed in objectivity is not immediate. The concept is not simply given in objectivity because it needs as a concept to free itself from its objectivity. That is to say, it needs to realize itself in a process in which it distinguishes itself from itself in order to determine itself and determine at the same time what Hegel calls the substantiality of objectivity itself. So in this introductory section, the structure of the realization of the idea already starts to be made explicit as a process of self-determination that is constitutively teleological, of course, according to the dynamic of internal purposiveness, and in being a teleological, it is based on a specific form of negativity, which is characterized by a self-referential character. I quote, the concept, inasmuch as it has truly attained its reality, is this absolute judgment, whose subject distinguishes itself as self-referring negative unity from its subjectivity, and is the latter's being in and for itself, but it refers to it essentially through itself, and is therefore self-directed purpose and impulse, end of quote. So in characterizing the idea as an object that has reached its reality, Hegel refers to absolute judgment. With this notion, I believe he has in mind the idea of judgment as original division, and this division of the idea is absolute because we are not dealing with the division of the idea from something else, but with the division of the idea from itself. The idea itself, in fact, is a concrete process of self-determination, must be in itself the distinction from itself, or rather, it is that subjectivity that distinguishes itself from itself as a negative unity from its own objectivity. This negative relation to its objectivity is not, however, that which abstractly separates the idea from objectivity. On the contrary, this negativity is what pushes it to realize itself in it, because it is the starting point of its own process of realization internal to reality itself. This determining value of negativity is what pushes the self-determination internal to objectivity, which is brought to light through what will be the immediate form of the idea in its immediacy, the logical idea of life, or rather the forms of the impulse and of self-directed purpose. It is precisely for this reason that in the following lines, Hegel refers to the subject as something that does not immediately have objectivity in it, because it is rather the realization of an end, and it is the objectivity posited by the activity of the end. Hegel defines the internal determinations in this process of realization of the idea through the reference to the determinations of the concept. So the idea is first of all a universal, the identity of the concept and objectivity, in which the opposition and negativity internal to the idea, which guided its process of determination, have not yet been made explicit. And then, secondly, it is this internal split of the idea, so the particularization of the idea, or this absolute judgment, so the split between subjectivity and objectivity that is made explicit, and with it, there is also room for the impulse to remove this separation. In this sense, the idea manifests its processual nature. I quote, "The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process." The idea, because of the freedom which the concept has attained in it, also has the most stubborn opposition within it. Its repose consists in the assurance and the certainty with which it eternally generates the opposition and eternally overcomes it, and in it rejoins itself. End of quote. Therefore, objectivity is conformable with the concept, with objectivity, but this does not mean that it is already in and for itself in conformity with the concept. To the extent that reality frees itself from the appearance of being simply changeable exteriority and contingencies, it shows itself in its truth and freedom, which is the truth and freedom of the concept. It is a living reality, or even a spiritual reality, which is impulse, movement. It is a reality which has a soul, and this soul is the idea itself. Then the concept will also show itself no longer as the concept, but as the soul and as the vital force of the reality itself. That is, as its very constitutive structure, as an idea, as its concrete truth. So Hegel closes this introductory section of the idea by anticipating the internal dialectic of the idea itself in its three moments. We have the first moment, the immediate idea as life, the concept penetrate objectivity and as the structure of internal purposiveness. The idea is in the form of existence of singularity. The idea, second moment, the idea of true and of the good, as knowing and willing, abstract universality that becomes abstract objectivity, and then absolute idea, truth that is in and for itself, infinite idea, idea that is absolute knowledge of itself. And so now I can start the section on life. The analysis of life, as Hegel points out at the beginning of the section, sounds strange in the science of logic, because logic, as we all know, is focused on the process of self-determination of thought in its pure form. And Hegel himself underlined his point when he claimed what follows, and I quote, "The idea of life has to do with a subject matter so concrete, and if you will, so real, that in dealing with it, one may seem, according to the common notion of logic, to have overstepped its boundaries." End of quote. So why does subjective logic necessarily analyze pure life in its pure form? Hegel claims that the subject matter of subjective logic is cognition, das Erkennen. That is, das sich selbst erfassen des Begriffs. So the concept comprehension of itself. And therefore, the logic analyzes the shapes of its presupposition, I quote, which is itself idea. End of quote. Therefore, the subject matter of subjective logic is the process of development of all the form in which the concept comes to know itself. That is to say, the process through which the concept determines itself and makes explicit its own logical structure. Life is one of this form, because the concept comprehends itself, first of all, as a subjectivity referring to an objectivity which is immediately self, and that is life. That is life in its immediacy, that is idea in its immediacy. Therefore, the concept has to comprehend itself in its immediacy, that is to say, the concept has to comprehend itself as life. Then the problem is to explain the reason why life is considered to be the idea in its immediacy. The idea is, I quote, the objective or real concept, end of quote. And it is, I quote again, the unity of subjective concept and objectivity, the concept inasmuch it has truly attained its reality, end of quote. This is the result of the dialectic of objectivity, where purposiveness turns out to realize what objectivity actually is. It is objectivity in its truth, namely the process of self-determination of the concept in its concrete existence. In this process, concept and reality get concretely united. As we have seen, this unity is the idea which has its first and immediate articulation in life. In fact, purposiveness ends up in being this very unity whose structure mirrors the structure of concrete universal concept. I quote, it is the self-equal universal, more precisely, inasmuch as it contains self-repelling negativity. It is universal, though at first still indeterminate activity. But since this activity is negative self-reference, it determines itself immediately and gives itself the moment of particularity. And this particularity, as likewise the totality of the form reflected into it, is content as against the posited differences of the form. The same negativity through its self-reference is just as immediately the reflection of the form into itself and singularity. So this unity is not concretely realized in subjective external purposiveness, but in internal purposiveness. As we know, the distinction between external and internal purposiveness is a Kantian distinction. Whereas the former one is analyzed in the teleology section, the latter is analyzed in the logical idea of life. In fact, the structure of internal purposiveness is the structure of life itself. Life is, I quote, the concept which, distinct from objectivity, simple in itself, permeates the objectivity, and a self-directed purpose as its means within it and posit it as its means, yet is immanent in this means and therein the realized purpose, identical with itself. As it is structured by internal purposiveness, life as a self-determining structure, something that gets developed according to an inner end, is something self-determined. And self-determination is the structure of the concept itself, and in this sense, life is idea. In the teleology section, Hegel refers to Kant's distinction between external and internal purposiveness and to the relation of the latter to life and idea. I quote, one of Kant's greatest services to philosophy was in drawing the distinction between relative and external purposiveness and internal purposiveness. In the latter, in internal purposiveness, it opened up the concept of life, the idea, end of quote. So Hegel returns to Kant's insight on internal purposiveness and life in the analysis of the living individual too, when he notes that, I quote, since the concept is immanent in it, the purposiveness of living being is to be grasped as inner, end of quote. This is why the concept in living individual has the structure of the idea. I quote, it is present in it as a determinate concept distinguished from its externality, but in thus distinguishing from itself from it, pervading it thoroughly and self-identical, end of quote. And in other words, I quote again, the subject is a purpose unto itself, the concept that has its means and subjective reality in the objectivity subjugated to it. As such, it is constituted as the idea existing in and for itself, end of quote. The concept is thus a subjectivity that is its difference from objectivity, and at the same time, it is identical with it and identical with itself in it. In this way, it is the subject-object identity that is the idea itself, at least in its immediate form. Idea is the self-determination of the subjective concepts in the other, namely objectivity, and life is the first immediate form of this process, and so it is the first immediate form of the idea. What is meant to be grasped in life is the content of life, not as a natural spiritual existence, but as a dynamic, a pure dynamic of the living processes, as a pure logical movement where subject and object become one on the basis of their own difference. This is a crucial dynamic, a crucial process, a crucial logical movement for Hegel's logic as a whole, inasmuch as the dialectic of his logical determination develops according to this very dynamic, that is to say, as the unity of opposite, which is the truth of the determinations themselves. Another introductory problem regarding the role life plays with respect not only to the sense of logic, but also to Hegel's system as a whole, is the difference between the logical idea of life, natural life, and life in spirit. Natural life has its condition in inorganic nature that is not presupposed by the logical idea of life. The natural life, or natural life, is nature in its highest stage, passing over into subjectivity. The logical idea of life is the concept that gets its first concrete and true form of realization in objectivity. Namely, is a process of realization of the concept in objectivity where it, I quote, has attained the externality truly corresponding to it, truly being adequate to it. Okay. End of quote. And the spiritual life is not natural life. However, spirit is a sort of living individual whose life gets embodied in different shape, as well as natural life. The life of spirit, I quote, obtain a determinateness from externality through the purposes and the activity of spirit, end of quote. After this introductory consideration, I will summarize the basic moment of the dialectic of life. We have three moments: the living individual, the life process, and the genus process. And I'll start with the first one, the living individual, which is the moment where the relation between living being and objectivity is analyzed. In its immediacy, living individual is meant to be a subjective totality indifferent with respect to objectivity. So what is being analyzed here is the relation of the living individual to itself. This indifference is what is sublated in the development of the three moments constituting the living individual. So we have a sort of a relation of the individual to itself, which turns out to be a relation of the individual to the other, which is objectivity. These three moments mirrors this, the indifference is what is sublated in the development of the three moments constituted the living individual, the individual itself, and these three moments mirror the three moments of the dialectic of the concept, and this confirms at this first level how life is the immediate form of idea, namely the immediate form of the unity of concept and objectivity. The three moments are sensibility, irritability, and reproduction, which corresponds respectively to universality, particularity, and singularity. And now I will briefly explain the nature of each moment, and I will clarify in which sense each one embodies one side of the concept. Firstly, sensibility corresponds to universality, abstract universality, as universality is the simple relation to itself of the living individual, which exists in the simple identity with itself. Every kind of difference is immediately sublated in this immediate relation of the individual with itself. Every external determinateness is the simple impression on the individual, and it is reduced to the individual self-feeling. This is why the sensibility, I quote, it is the in itselfness, not as abstract simplicity, but as an infinite, determinable receptivity that does not become, in its determinateness, anything manifold and external, but is absolutely reflected into itself. End of quote. The negativity of the living individual as sensitive individual is still only, I quote, as inherently absolute negativity. End of quote. So each external element is not acknowledged as such, Therefore, since everything external is reduced to the simple self-feeling of the individual, this individual is not really other-related, but it is still simply and abstractly self-related. The negativity at the base of sensibility is the living organism neither to determine its other nor to determine itself on the basis of the relation with its disorder, because this negativity does not allow the organism to act on objectivity and on itself. Quite the contrary, the organism is simply and passively determined by objectivity. Second moment, irritability, which corresponds to particularity. And as particularity, it is the first abstract identity with itself that gets developed in the moment of difference and of the relation to other. The relation to the living individual to itself becomes a relation to other. And the living individual posits this first determinateness because it opens up to external world and it reacts against external stimulations. I quote, the self-determination of living being, it's its judgment, or the self-limiting whereby it refers to the outside as to a presupposed objectivity with respect with which it is in reciprocal activity. End of quote. Thanks to its irritability, the individual develops the capability to live in that relation with the other that was suppressed in the living's being mere sensibility. The individual is therefore, I quote, the opening up of the negativity otherwise locked up in simple self-feeling, end of quote. The individual is not only determined by its external environment, but it is also the self-determination on the basis of the stimulations coming from external environment. And moreover, it is the acting on this very environment. Thirdly, reproduction corresponds to individuality. And here in reproduction, the living organism embodies a relation to itself rooted in the relation to other, which was irritability. So reproduction here is not to be taken as the reproduction of the individual in another individual. The reproduction Hegel is referring to in this moment is internal reproduction, namely the process through which the living individual grows and replaces its parts and cells, only the relation to objectivity and in responding to the stimuli coming from the outside world. Therefore, the relation to other becomes a self-relation through which the individual maintains itself. In this turning point, the logical structure of opposition turns out to be the self-determining dynamic of living individual. The structure of its realization is a negative unity with objectivity. Objectivity is not like the other as such, nor it is another which stands in a relation of mutual determination with the living individual. Objectivity is concretely united with living individual in the process of reproduction, which is the process of assimilation of objectivity through which the individual maintains itself, is identical with itself, and then realizes its own vitality. I quote, the unity of the concept posits itself in its externality as negative unity, and this is reproduction. In reproduction, life is something concrete and vital. In it alone does it also have feeling and power of resistance. Feeling, insensibility, and power of resistance is irritability, which maintains as moment of this relation to itself of the individual in reproduction. So in reproduction, I quote, the living being posits itself as actual individuality, a self-referring being for itself, end of quote, because it is an individual that is at home with itself in its other. So in their relation, the moment of sensibility, irritability, and reproduction show how the living individual determines itself on the basis of a negativity that is characterized by the same dynamic characterizing the negativity of the concept as such. On the one hand, this negativity consists in a relation to itself, sensibility, that is at the same time a relation to other, irritability. On the other hand, this relation to other, irritability, is at the same time a relation to itself, reproduction. This negativity is essentially self-referential. In fact, the individual realizes its own vitality in a process of self-negation that is, it's going toward its other in order to be united with it and to realize itself in this unity. In the unity with this other, living being is concretely identical with itself. It produces and reproduces itself. It maintains itself as living being. The unity of the living individual and objectivity is the constitutive relation where objectivity is no longer something indifferent, because it affects the way of being of the organism and changes its internal articulation. This is what Hegel means when he writes, I quote, "The unrest and the mutability of the external side of the living being is the manifestation in it of the concept, and the concept has in itself negativity as objectivity insofar as this objectivity's indifferent subsistence shows itself to be self-sublating." End of quote. In this sense, the living organism maintains itself through its own changes, that is to say, through its own self-differentiation. This dynamic relation between living being and objectivity gets a further determination in the second moment of life, which is the living process. The key dynamic of the living process is need, and in need the living being develops its intrinsic self-referential negativity, the negation of negation. This negativity articulates itself in two essential moments. Firstly, need is the relation of individual to its other. The living being, I quote, refers itself to another to it, end of quote. So it relates itself to what it misses. In this sense, the living being, I quote, posits itself as negated. It is its own negation. Namely, it is not the not being of what it needs. In this first articulation of need, the negativity in action is simply the first negation. In feeling what it misses, in feeling what I miss, the organism as in itself is not being. That is its own negation. In this first moment of the need, the self-referential character of negation intrinsic in living being is already evident. In this very self-negation, the organism seems simply to lose itself. It seems to be simply denied. But then we have the second moment of need. The need is not simply the relation of the individual to its other. The feeling of the other as something missing is also the relation to itself of the living individual. Actually, in this intrinsic negativity, the living being is concretely at home with itself. I quote, need, that is the twofold moment of self-determination of the living being by which the latter posits itself as negated and thereby refers itself to another than it, to the indifferent objectivity. But, and this is the second moment, this self-loss, it is equally not lost. In this self-loss, it is equally not lost. It preserves itself in it and remains the identity of the self-equal concept. The living being is thereby the impulse to posit as its own this word, which is other than it, to posit itself as equal to it, to sublate the word and objectivity itself. End of quote. Therefore, the inner constitution of need is not only a first abstract negation. The individual is not simply the not being of what it needs, namely the not being of the other. It is not simply denied, or more explicitly, it is not lost in this negation. Need is also the second negation, namely it is a concrete negation, that is a negation where living being realizes itself. In needing its other, living being is essentially this other by having it in itself as what it needs, as what it misses. So in need, the objectivity is constitutively inherent in the living being, and it is inherent in its radical otherness because it subsists as negated, namely as what the individual is missing, and therefore as what is other than the individual itself. In need, the other is the presence of the absence. In need, the other is not simply in relation with the individual, it lies within it, and this is shown by the pain felt by the organism itself. as Muir writes, I quote, that the tension of unsatisfied want is painful is the clearest indication that the wanted object lies within the subject, end of quote. Yet, need is not only the presence of the absence in the individual. Need is also what moves the living individual towards its other in order to assimilate it. Hence, need is what guides individual self-determining process through which the organism turns the presence of the absence into an actual presence. In fact, need is embodied in the individual's urge to get what he misses and make it its own. In the process raised by need, the living being becomes concretely identical with its other in the appropriation of the object. This is the process of assimilation. They are one and the same thing. Its self-determination has therefore the form of objective externality, and since it is at the same time self-identical, it is the absolute contradiction, absolute Widerspruch. End of quote. Need is the presence of the absence that is, in fact, turned into something present. In this way, the individual is what is present and identical with itself, and objectivity is what is absent in and different from the individual, but at the same time is made present and identical with it. Therefore, the structure of the need at the basis of the living process is the contradictory structure of the speculative truth, namely the identity of identity and non-identity, or the unity of opposites. I quote, need and the impulse that constitute the transition by which the individual, in being for itself the negation of itself, also become for itself identity, an identity which only is as the negation of that negation, end of quote. As the self-contradiction of the living process is the self-moving and self-determining principle of the organism itself, or better say, the principle of its realization. I quote, in that process it posits itself as it is in and for itself, namely as self-identical in its otherness, in an otherness, posited as an indifferent to it, as the negative unity of the negative, end of quote. And then we have the last moment of the dialectic of the logical idea of life, the genus process. The contradictory identity of living being and objectivity gets a further articulation in the last moment of the dialectic of life, that is the genus process. In this process, the organism faces an objectivity whose fixed and one-sided self-subsistence is completely sublated, because it is, I quote, an objectivity which is identical with it, and a relating of the living being to itself as to another living being, end of quote. The genus is the self-feeling of a living being in another living being. It is a relation of identity with itself in its other, and thus it has again an inherently contradictory structure. The contradiction in question has the same structure that characterizes love in the manuscript of the early teleological writing, where Hegel writes what follows, and I quote, in love, life is present as a duplicate of itself. And as a single and unified self. In love, that separate does still remain, but as something united and no longer separate. Life senses life. End of quote. In a similar way, in the last moment of the dialectic of life, Hegel claims, I quote, the relation of genus is the identity of individual self-feeling in such a one who is at the same time another self-subsistent individual. It is a contradiction. Accordingly, the living being is once more impulse. End of quote. This very contradiction gives rise to the urge of each organism to go towards itself, to feel itself in another independent organism, to get united with it. Only in this unity does the organism feel concretely itself, because only in being one with its other does it realize itself as genus, namely life as concrete universal, or differently said, life in its truth. This process, the genus process, has two sides. On the one hand, this process can be viewed from the perspective of the living individuals. In the genus process, the living being comes to life and passes over into a new organism. This gives rise to a sort of bad infinity, where the living being manifests its own finitude and where the genus is only in itself. The living individual is only a necessary but not sufficient condition for the concrete realization of the genus as a concrete universality. The genus is immediately present in the individual, but this immediacy is necessarily sublated with the death of the individual itself. But on the other hand, this process can be viewed from the perspective of the genus, which has its concrete and infinite existence in the birth and death of finite organisms. In this way, the relation between genus and living individuals is similar to the relation between finite and infinity in the doctrine of being. The genus is not something abstract and completely separated from existing living beings. Rather, it realizes itself only as their infinite process of sublation. Therefore, the genus is no more simply in itself. It is not simply immediately present in its particularization, that are the living beings. The genus is concretely determined in and for itself. It is the process of mediation of living beings themselves. That is, they come into being and passing by into other living beings. In this way, I quote, the idea implicitly as genus becomes explicit in that it has sublated its particularity that constituted the living species and has thereby given itself a reality which is itself simple universality. And I think that's all.
Muchas gracias, Miquela, por la presentación. Em, y ahora tenemos tiempo para comentarios, preguntas y participaciones de parte de los participantes. Pueden levantar la mano para intervenir.
Yo tengo una pregunta. Miquela, ¿te la planteo en inglés? Let me
If you
see.
speak slowly, you can speak ask in Spanish, so it's easier for everyone, I think. But slowly, please.
Eh,
De vagar.
es una, okay, yeah. Es una pregunta muy específica que tiene que ver con un debate que me interesa mucho sobre el sentido del proceso vital. En el debate aparecen dos lecturas, una que hace del proceso vital, ¿is it okay? Or should I change? Yeah. Una que hace del proceso vital un momento de asimilación, como has dicho repetidamente, de la objetividad. Y otra lectura que ve en ese momento una superación de la objetividad. Ese debate es relevante, bueno, en la ciencia de la lógica quizá no se aprecia hasta qué punto es relevante, pero se vuelve muy relevante.
I lost the last thing
Yes.
you said because internet is not working so well. So I got the two readings: the moment, the assimilation as a moment of the assimilation of objectivity, and the other one is the superation of objectivity.
Yes.
Okay.
Y agregaba que esta diferencia, que este matiz es relevante para una lectura de la ciencia de la lógica y de la filosofía de la naturaleza. Cuando se habla de asimilación en el primer sentido, se manifiesta una posible lectura del organismo como vinculado con el medio o con la objetividad, de manera permanente. Mientras que en la segunda lectura aparece una imagen de un organismo que llega a ser independiente de su medio ambiente, digamos, ¿no? Quería saber si tú aquí en la ciencia de la lógica encuentras este matiz porque yo no, yo lo veo claramente en la filosofía de la naturaleza y sé que esta es, digamos, eh, el momento estructural que explicaría esos procesos en la filosofía de la naturaleza, pero aquí no me parece que sea tan evidente. Aquí me parece que se trata de una asimilación en un sentido que no elide, que no anula la objetividad, pero quería saber qué es lo que piensas.
Gracias. I think that the answer depends on what you mean by superation of objectivity. But we can try to understand it from the implication that you mentioned about the philosophy of nature. So you said that the first reading imply reading of the organism, which is vinculated to objectivity in a permanent way, and the second one, we have a view of the organism that is independent from its own environment in the philosophy of nature. Okay. If I think what is going on in the philosophy of nature, I don't understand. I take let's suppose that the second reading is the one that is working here. And this would imply this independence of the individual organism from its own environment. And I don't understand what this actually means when we think of the end of the philosophy of nature. Because
you don't understand. ¿Qué es lo que no entiendes?
No, I don't understand. I cannot make sense of what independence means when I think what's going on at the end of the philosophy of nature. Mm-hmm. Because we have something that is quite similar of what is going on here. Okay. Mm-hmm. We have a living organism. It talks about the assimilation process. There is a lot of some pages about the process of digestion and then the genus process. And when we are thinking of this independence, I'm thinking of the passage from the philosophy of nature to the philosophy of spirit.
Exactly.
But then, in order to account for these passages, I think that independence is a strong word for what is going on there. Because independence means a kind of separation, and there is actually a separation there between a nature and spirit, but there is also but Hegel accounts for this separation through the dialectic of positing and presupposing. And this relation of position and presupposition of spirit with respect to nature is something that is not as strong as a relation of independence, I think. So this is why I'm not completely convinced of the second reading. Is the second reading implies this independence, which for me is a separation which is not accounted for through the notion of position and presupposition. Seems to be something. There is a relation there. There is a separation, but nature is always presupposed. And in here, then we have the same relation when it comes to the passage from life to the from life to the notion of to the idea of good, to know, because what is going on there when it is talking of the vital process. If I look at the section as a whole, I was trying to think, after reconstructing all the singular moment of the section, I was trying to think of the process as a whole. What is doing here? And actually, there is a subjective notion and objectivity. At the beginning, he is talking of a relation when he's talking of the living individual, where the living individual is close in a relation to itself, and it progressively opens up to the other. And this happens with the reproduction process. Then the other is recognized as another. And the second moment is all a kind of work to give an account of the relation between the two. The final point there is to arrive as a negative unity between the other and objectivity. But this negative unity is concretely realized only with the third one, because in the third one we have a recognition dynamic, because the objectivity is not only in a negative unity, but they are in a negative unity with another different, which is at the same time identical with it, which is then it is a process of assimilation, yeah, of course, but it is also a process of recognition when we arrive at the genus process. But it is also, I would perfectly buy the notion of superation of the second reading, because what is superated is this exteriority, which at the beginning was not even recognized, then is present, but only as external, but then is concretely recognized with the third moment. But I think that this superation is not an independence of the individual, because if it was an independence, that would be something out of what is independent that would remain as external. And so this would not make sense of the definition of the idea as a whole.
Sí, gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Y ahora, Javier, adelante.
Sí, ahondando en la misma pregunta y creo que también muy en la línea de la misma respuesta, yo también lo veo como un proceso de asimilación. Claro, es que en la idea ya tenemos el sujeto-objeto. La idea ya parte, de hecho, de esa unidad. Entonces, sería un paso atrás que la objetividad quedara simplemente negada y al final acabáramos en una especie de sujeto encapsulado. No puede ser. De hecho, incluso hasta qué punto la pregunta no sería dándole un poco la vuelta, ¿no?, al planteamiento, hasta qué punto esta unidad sujeto-objeto en el concepto de alguna manera ya estaba, por lo menos el concepto estaba...
Devagar.
Sí, tienes razón, voy a intentar. ¿Hasta qué punto en el concepto o el propio concepto no estaba ya trabajando y había ganado mucho ya en relación a esta unidad sujeto-objeto? Entonces, en la idea, seguro que ya partimos de ahí. Seguro que ya partimos de ahí. Entonces, indirectamente, además, creo que podemos reafirmar esta lectura trayendo a colación una crítica que hace Kant, o sea, que hace Hegel a Kant, cuando acusa a Kant de, bueno, pues de tratar las ideas. Bueno, hay una crítica y hay un elogio, hay dos cosas. Por una parte, Hegel dice, Kant ha visto lo incondicionado en la idea, lo absoluto en la idea, y eso es elogiable. Pero por otra parte, ha tratado la idea como si fuera algo puramente subjetivo. No ha sido consecuente con la dimensión que ha descubierto en la idea, porque ha tratado la idea como si fuera un ideal regulativo. Incluso, bueno, en el contexto de la propia vida, en la crítica del juicio, Kant se comporta así, no solamente en el uso teórico, sino que Kant dice, con respecto a los organismos, que podemos presuponer que están regidos por un principio regulador interno, que en los organismos coinciden el medio y el fin, pero que no lo podemos saber, sino que para investigarlos lo podemos presuponer como un ideal regulativo. Y entonces aquí Hegel se enfada, porque claro, ¿dónde queda lo incondicionado de la idea si al final tratamos la idea como algo puramente subjetivo que solamente tiene validez para el sujeto, para regir la investigación del sujeto, pero luego no la reconocemos en su infinitud? Y aquí infinitud significa unidad sujeto-objeto. De manera que si Hegel le está criticando esto a Kant, eh, mm, implícitamente pues está diciendo que tratar la idea como algo puramente subjetivo, pues eso no es hacerse cargo de su infinitud. Así que creo que indirectamente podemos deducir que esa es la lectura buena para la vida, que es la idea inmediata, ¿no? Tiene que ser ya la unidad sujeto-objeto. La pregunta sería, esto yo creo que es más complejo, ¿por qué el concepto no es ya la unidad sujeto-objeto? La idea seguro que lo es. Y el concepto está trabajando en ello todavía, pero ya casi el concepto lo tiene.
Sí. There was a part in the section where he was mentioning that. I was looking for it. I'm not gonna find it. It was a couple of lines. It's precisely on this point. It tells. He writes. I'm trying to remember. He writes that the concept already has its own determinateness. It already determines itself as particularity and as individuality. But it was a kind of pure structure, and he underlines that this pure structure of universality, particularity, individuality needs to integrate in itself. It uses a lot of the word exteriority, not only objectivity. I don't know. And he also used the word actual concept. In my impression, it is as if the first part of the doctrine of the concept, as far as I understood something about that, is presenting a kind of pure structure. Okay? And then is trying to understand, which is already objective. But then he tries to show how it gets concretely embodied in some kind of objective processes. In order to do that, he looks at objectivity and they show how these processes progressively emerges, these objective processes progressively emerges as the structure of the concept itself. So when we have subjectivity and objectivity, we have the structure of the concept, then it starts to make explicit how this structure is embodied in objective processes. And then he has this conformity, which is this immediate unity that we have at the beginning of the idea. But then this is a unity that is still immediate and need to be known, need to be comprehended. I think
la idea,
it's the idea that knows itself. We have the pure structure, we have the objective processes. We see that there is a conformity between them. There is a relation of adequacy. But then we need to make sense of this adequacy, which is still immediate. We have the pure structure of the idea, but then the idea needs to know itself. And the first way to know itself is to know itself as life, which is still completely objective. But it seems that life is a kind of intermediate section in between objectivity and the idea. No? I don't know.
Si
Yo creo
puedo
la idea...
intervenir.
Sí, Zaida, sí, sí.
Perdón, nada más me gustaría recordar que precisamente al final de la teleología, parece que teleología y vida tejen ahí algo como una transición
Mm,
que demuestra la estructura profunda. Yo lo diría en estos términos. Miquela, tú has dicho que el proceso de la ciencia, de la doctrina del concepto es un progresivo emerger. Yo diría que es un progresivo profundizar
mm,
en una estructura básica eh, que revela cada vez más la, eh, el vínculo o la relación de sí a sí de la idea,
ujú,
la relación que tiene consigo la idea. Y hay unos momentos de sutura de eso suena un poco, no es quizá la mejor metáfora, eh, pero a mí me sigue costando mucho trabajo entender la secuencia lógica en el sentido hegeliano de la teología y de la vida. Por eso digo sutura. En estos capítulos se muestra la sutura y se revela al concepto como idea. Al final de la sección de la teleología, Hegel lo dice, ¿no? Hay el descubrimiento de que la verdad del concepto es que es idea, ¿no? Que es una idea. Y esa verdad se revela cuando Hegel en la teleología empieza a hablar de esta relación de sí a sí con el concepto, ¿no? Este último apartado en donde ya no se refiere a la relación exterior, sino a una relación autoproducción, digámoslo así, de sí mismo, es donde emerge la identidad del concepto con la idea. Entonces, lo que preguntabas, Javier, no sé cómo interpretarlo, porque dices, ¿por qué no el concepto? ¿Por qué sí la idea? ¿Por qué no el concepto? No entiendo bien la pregunta.
Sí, a ver, a lo mejor quería enfatizar que la idea ya tiene la unidad sujeto-objeto. Por tanto, la vida tiene que ser una asimilación del objeto, no puede ser una negación del objeto, porque como idea inmediata la vida ya es la unidad de ambos momentos. Que en todo caso podríamos preguntarnos si en el concepto, de alguna manera, esta unidad no estaba ya ganada. Ganada no, desde luego, pero desde luego que el concepto estaba trabajando en ella. Porque ¿qué otra cosa es la subjetividad? Claro, el concepto tiene dos partes, subjetividad y objetividad. Y la subjetividad consiste en transitar a la objetividad y en empezar ya a poner la mediación del sujeto y el objeto. Y la objetividad, lo mismo pero al revés. Es decir, en la objetividad el objeto se despliega poniendo la estructura del silogismo, ¿no? Mostrando cómo la tiene en sí mismo y por tanto es una transición a la subjetividad, de vuelta. Y tanto es así que la teleología vuelve a partir de la subjetividad, ¿no? Porque el fin subjetivo es el primer momento y lo que tenemos ahí pues es una acción que intenta realizarse a través de un medio. Es decir, partimos de lo subjetivo y luego vamos a intentar poner la objetividad. Entonces, ya el concepto estaba en ello. El concepto estaba ya intentando poner esta mediación. Lo que pasa es que yo creo que, claro, la idea la habéis dicho fenomenal, porque efectivamente lo que gana la idea es el poder partir ya de la unidad sujeto-objeto. Poder
no
tomarla
entendí.
como inmediata. El
Ah,
concepto no podía hacer eso. El concepto ha trabajado
Javier,
para
¿puedes ir
poder...
más lento?
Sí,
desculpa,
es que me cuesta muchísimo, perdón.
desculpa.
Digamos que la idea parte del trabajo del concepto. El concepto es el que ha trabajado para poner la mediación del sujeto y el objeto. Se lo ha trabajado él. Y la idea ya vive de las rentas, es decir, aprovecha ese
Ujú,
punto de partida que el concepto le ha entregado. Y por eso la idea puede ser una mediación de sí a sí. Es por eso. La idea ya está en el punto de partida de la infinitud, el concepto no. El concepto parte de momentos unilaterales y pone la infinitud a partir de ahí, trabaja. para poner esa mediación de los dos momentos. Pero a la idea se lo han dado ya hecho, de manera que al poder partir ya de lo infinito, lo que tenemos ya en la idea es la infinitud que desde sí misma se despliega a sí misma y retorna a sí misma, que es la forma más perfecta de exposición. Esto va a ser el método para Hegel. Y esto es lo que hemos ganado en la idea, efectivamente, que pueda hacerse este movimiento de sí a sí, porque ya podemos partir de la infinitud. Y hago un paréntesis aquí, añado que ahora me parece, desde esta perspectiva, tiene todo el sentido que lo que encontrábamos en la transición a la objetividad, en el concepto, fuera la crítica al argumento ontológico tal y como Kant la planteaba. Porque el argumento ontológico debería partir de la infinitud, del punto de vista de la idea. Y sin embargo, Hegel lo pone en el concepto, que todavía no parte de la infinitud. ¿Por qué? Porque se está refiriendo a la crítica que le va a hacer a Kant. En definitiva, ¿qué le dice a Kant? Mire usted, Kant, esto de los cientaleros, con eso no funciona el argumento ontológico, porque el argumento ontológico no puede partir de lo finito. Tiene que partir de algo infinito. ¿Cuándo podemos hacer eso? En la idea. ¿Por qué Hegel menciona el argumento ontológico en el concepto? Pues en definitiva, a mí me parece que porque el concepto, no sé qué pensáis, sucumbe a la misma crítica que Hegel está haciendo a Kant. El concepto parte de lo finito y se remonta a lo infinito. Y nos entrega un resultado que es muy valioso, porque desde ahí podemos cerrar el círculo, desde el propio círculo. Pero en cuanto a proceso, el concepto todavía no es la idea y todavía está en un punto de vista limitado. No se puede, y por eso Hegel denosta todas las demostraciones de la existencia de Dios que parten de la finitud, como el argumento físico-teleológico, partiendo de la finitud e intentando ponerlo infinito. Así no podemos pensar a Dios especulativamente, hay que partir de lo infinito. Y el concepto, pues a mi juicio, es la escalera, es el esfuerzo de la dialéctica por ganar este punto de partida. Ahora ya sí para hacer la exposición especulativa de lo absoluto, que es la idea.
Just a
Me
comment.
embalo, lo siento, es que me acelero. Siento.
Just an observation, just to understand if I got what you said. You're saying that the difference between concept and the idea is that the idea is working, is a kind of conceptual comprehension of a structure which was already developed through the dialectic of the concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. I found a passage where Hegel was mentioning this problem. So maybe we can take a time to read it. Not a lot of lines. It says what follows. For the concept, and now here I think he's referring to the dialectic of the concept that we find at the beginning of the doctrine of the notion of the concept. For the concept is as such itself already, as you were saying, it is already the identity of itself and reality. So it already is subject-object. For the indeterminate expression, reality means nothing but determinate being. So the concept already determines itself, and it determines itself as particularity and individuality. And this is the concept, its determinate being, possesses in its particularity and singularity. And here I have the confirmation that he's talking exactly about this dialectic. Then he mentioned what I find in objectivity. I find objectivity, moreover, is likewise the total concept. So I have the same totality, the same process, basically the same structure, that has withdrawn into itself or with itself out of its determinateness. So I take what is the specific determinateness of the concept, which is an integrated unity, and I see what happens when I negate it and I withdraw myself in the complete exteriority, which is the mechanical process. Then he says, he writes, in the subjectivity of the concept, the determinateness or the difference of the latter is the reflective shine which is immediately sublated, withdrawn into being for itself or into a negative unity, an inherent predicate. And here I think is when he's saying of this reflective shine, where he is immediately sublate, I think he's referring to this passage from the pure subject, the structure of the concept, to objectivity again. Because objectivity afterwards is going to be the predicate of the concept. And here he's using exactly this terminology. And then he says, but in this objectivity, the determinateness is posited as immediate totality, as external whole. So I have a totality, an objective totality. At the beginning seems to be simply an aggregate of external elements, and that it shows to be a totality in the same sense of the concept when I come to the teleological process, an integrated totality. Okay. But it is still, he writes, an external whole. So there is a relation of exteriority between what was the pure structure, what was the pure structure of the concept, and it's withdrawing into this objective totality. And then he says, comes to the idea. The idea has shown itself to be the concept liberated again into its subjectivity. So it is as if the first concept was was already closed in a kind of subjectivity, which is not the subjectivity that Hegel was criticizing. I think it's not the same. It has not to do with the critic he's presenting to Kant that you, Javier, was mentioning. But it is a kind of objectivity, of subjectivity. I have the structure of subjectivity, but the subjectivity is not already properly objective. And it says here, now the idea has shown itself to be concept liberated against into its subjectivity. So the concept has liberated from its subjective dimension, from the immediacy into which it has sunk into object. So it is as if in the first section, in the first part, the structure of the concept is still closed in a kind of subjective dimension, which is not subjective as the subjective character of Kant's ideas. It is another kind of subjectivity, I think. And at the same time, in objectivity, I have an integrated totality, which is still immediate. And then in what is doing here and at its beginning, starting to do here is starting to analyze the relation between these two dimensions in order to account for the unity. Because here I say that we have the first part, the structure of the concept closed in a kind of subjective dimension, and then in objectivity I have the concept sunk in the object. And then he says it is the subject that distinguishes itself from its objectivity. But an objectivity which is no less determined by it and possesses its substantiality only in the concept, which is precisely what we find in life. We see a subject, a subjectivity, because it is something that determines itself, the living individual, and through its own self-determining process, it is not only the soul of itself, but it is also the soul, the substantiality of the objectivity, which at the beginning is something independent, or something that is external to it.
Ya en cierta manera, la teleología, efectivamente, porque además es que están muy unidas, teleología y el tratamiento del organismo en la vida. Bueno, para Kant también era parte de la teleología, el tratamiento del organismo. Entonces, realmente la idea de la vida es la teleología 2.0 mejorada, porque para entender, yo creo que es muy útil comparar cómo opera la subjetividad en la vida, que aquí es el organismo individual vivo, la individualidad viva, compararla con qué pasaba con la subjetividad en la teleología, porque son muy parecidas. Tenemos un deseo, tenemos un fin subjetivo, o tenemos un impulso vital que quiere realizarse a través de la objetividad. ¿Cuál es la diferencia? Pues que en la teleología el fin subjetivo tiene que cobrar realidad a través de un medio externo. El medio es externo, cae fuera. Y en la vida no. En la vida, y por eso aquel círculo se cierra inmanentemente. Y por eso en la teleología no, porque el individuo vivo adapta el medio a sí a través de sus operaciones vitales. No necesita un instrumento. Pensemos en un animal que a través de la alimentación, fijaos qué gráfico, ¿no? El proceso de alimentarse, escoger la objetividad e incorporarla, asimilarla, metabolizarla en tu propia, para que pase a formar parte de tu propia realidad. O sea, por eso digo que es la teleología mejorada, lo estás haciendo sin instrumento, comiéndote la realidad a bocaos. Y el otro ejemplo es la reproducción, ¿no? Tanto la producción de la propia vida a través de la nutrición, como la reproducción de la individualidad misma en otro individuo, son formas de mantener o sea, de realizarte en la objetividad. O bien porque la objetividad es tu propio cuerpo individual y te nutres, o bien porque tu objetividad cae en otro, pero eres tú mismo en otro. Bueno, hay una dialéctica interesante, ¿no? Pero aquí la cuestión es que el medio es interno. Por eso la vida es la teleología interna. Claro que es la teleología, pero interna. Y hemos cerrado el círculo inmanentemente. Ya partimos de una estructura que es la unidad sujeto-objeto. Y lo que ocurre en el proceso de la vida es que en el despliegue inmanente de esta actividad viva, pues van apareciendo sus determinaciones. Pero aquí la exposición es perfecta, es totalmente perfecta, como la quiere la lógica, porque es inmanente. Ya no hay presupuestos externos de ningún tipo, ni siquiera el medio. Ahora bien, me surgen... ¿Queréis decir? Ah, vale. Luego pongo un paréntesis, ¿vale? Porque me he acordado mucho de Marx cuando leía esto, ¿vale? Más que, o sea, aparte de Kant, me acuerdo mucho de Marx, pero luego lo digo.
Yo nada más quería insistir en la importancia de este pasaje para la comprensión tanto del concepto de subjetividad como del concepto de objetividad, ¿no? Los dos conceptos, los dos términos, digámoslo así, reconfiguran sus valencias, se reconfiguran su significado cuando se habla en términos de teleología interna. La objetividad me parece que una manera, una clave de lectura de este tránsito de la teleología externa a la teleología interna es la objetividad. Es que la objetividad pierde un carácter de exterioridad, de diferencia indiferente. Se vuelve una diferencia integrada a la propia subjetividad, ¿no? Por eso,
Cuerpo.
sí. Por eso la objetividad en la vida adquiere una especie de subjetividad, ¿no? Como que
Alma.
lo que has dicho, ¿no? Los alimentos, el espacio, los otros, ¿no? En el proceso vital son parte de la vida y son parte de la singularidad, ¿no? Es así que se particulariza mediante lo otro, pero eso otro no es instrumentalizado, sino asimilado, incorporado. Por eso me interesa tanto esta sección de la asimilación, que en efecto, como decía Miquela, tiene una lectura paralela respecto a la discusión del reconocimiento, ¿no? ¿Qué es integrar al otro? ¿Qué significa en este contexto realmente integrar al otro? Consumirlo y luego desecharlo, o consumirlo, procesarlo, integrarlo, y que eso sirva para la reconfiguración permanente de la subjetividad.
Can I say something about this? Because it's a point that is really, it's a very interesting point because It deals with a kind of negative dynamic that is going on there in between subjectivity and objectivity. What we mean when we're talking about assimilation. Because there is a point where we also mention the word violence. When we are assimilating the other, we are doing a kind of violence. But we never have to forget that this assimilation is performed, first of all, through, it's not a positive, it's not just an imposition, an affirmation of myself in the other. I need to deny myself. There is a self-related negativity that is going on there. And I change all the time. These are, no, it's not a simulation where I just keep my own identity as it is, and that's all. It is an assimilation where the other elements that I am assimilating changes me, transforms it all the time. And I'm able to maintain my own identity only so far as I change and transform all the time. And the other point, I mentioned the words recognition at the end of the presentation, which has to do with the problem that you were mentioning when you were talking of the sense of subjectivity at the beginning. We have a subjectivity with an objectivity which is different, is external. But this same objectivity comes to be part of my own subjectivity. And to the extent that Hegel claims that my subjectivity is the soul of this objectivity. And the most interesting part for me is the last part, when this objectivity is in itself a subjectivity, because it is another which is equal to me. In this sense, what is going on there, according to my reading, is a kind of recognition process, because it perfectly says that what is going on as the beginning is a self-feeling. I have this self-feeling right from the beginning when I start being a sensitive individual. But this self-feeling, my relation to myself, gets more and more concrete to the extent that I have a more radical relation with the other, especially when I have a more radical relation with another, which is another living individual. I was talking about this in yesterday class with my students, and I don't even remember how it comes to talk about this, because when he's talking about need, impulse, when he's talking about of my relation, my sexual relation with another individual, this is the perfect example of the moments in which, when I am completely negating myself to be with the other, I concretely feel myself. And that's kind of paradoxical. That's why he talked about contradiction here. That's why he was talking about it. I think that the passage of the early writing that I was mentioning is concerned with life. But the difference between the young Hegel and the mature Hegel is that for the young Hegel, this was still a mystery. And now he managed to build a conception of rationality, try to account for that mystery that was messing up with his mind since he was young.
Yeah, I have a follow-up comment. Perdón, ya cambié. Cuando hablamos de objetividad en relación a esta subjetividad, cuando hablamos de objetividad y subjetividad en esta nueva reconfiguración de la idea, yo he tenido un problema de interpretación. Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que estás diciendo, Miquela, pero siempre me queda una duda. la objetividad, o sea, a ver, antes de plantear mi duda, agregaría a lo que has dicho que cuando se trata de negarme a mí misma, se trata también de volverme objetividad para el otro, podríamos decirlo así, ¿no? Para que mi subjetividad como objetividad pueda también constituir a esa otra subjetividad. En eso esa lectura me interesa mucho. Pero antes de que eso ocurra, volviendo a la estructura lógica de la identidad entre subjetividad y objetividad que aparece al inicio de la idea en su inmediatez, me pregunto si esa objetividad no está en su origen afectada o maldecida o atravesada por la subjetividad. En otras palabras, me pregunto si esa objetividad no está vinculada a las necesidades y a la configuración de la subjetividad. Por ejemplo, volviendo al punto y trasladándolo a la filosofía de la naturaleza, en donde podemos ver mejor la cuestión, un organismo, un organismo singular, su objetividad la constituye su medio, pero es un medio que el organismo necesita, ¿no? La objetividad de un organismo representa la comida que puede ingerir, las otras especies con las que se relaciona, ¿no? La objetividad no es la totalidad de lo ente en general, sino algo que se relaciona con la subjetividad. Entonces me pregunto si esa objetividad en principio no está marcada por una subjetividad. En otras palabras, y para decirlo ya por última vez, me pregunto si esa objetividad no es deudora de la subjetividad. ¿Qué tan enriquecedor es el proceso de asimilación para la objetividad que no tiene independencia de la subjetividad que la produce hasta cierto punto?
Oh, no. um, this is a problem that maybe is related with a concern that I always had when I go back to read this passage. And I'm thinking of the passage where Hegel says that all the determination each determination of the logic is a definition of the absolute. But the problem here, when I dealing with the structure of life, for me it seems to be that I'm dealing with a kind of objectivity, which is the specific objectivity that is in relation with the living being. Okay, so with an objectivity which is dependent from objectivity. And I was always, this was the problem that I never solved. But my problem was, in which sense can we consider that life is the definition of the absolute, and in which sense life is the truth of mechanism, chemism, and teleology? Because I still have, and Hegel writes this in the section, I still have mechanical, chemical, teleological processes which are not living processes, which are not incorporated by living process, of course. Only parts of them are incorporated by living processes. I honestly don't know how to solve this problem, but the difference is not... I'm thinking out loud here. What is going on is that I'm doing a quantitative distinction here for the process that are involved in the chemical, mechanical, chemical, teleological process that are involved in living processes, and the ones that are not. And maybe this is not really relevant for him. Maybe he want to say that until I have not shown the relation between not all, chemical, mechanical, chemical, teleological processes and self-determining structure, that is the structure of subjectivity, I didn't tell all the story about what self-determination means. And I start seeing what self-determination means already at the end of the teleology. But now I need to see how self-determination comprehends itself. It's cognition, is what he names cognition at the beginning of the section, I think. So for me, it's not a matter of it does not involve all quantitative picking, all the process, but I have not tell all the story about these processes until I see how the self-determining structure of the concept is related with what was going on already in objectivity. Maybe, but I'm not really sure about my answer. It's a problem that is always going on here.
Yo diría que la vida tiene un desenlace demasiado trágico como para ser lo absoluto en su plenitud ya consumada. Porque en la sección del género, esa dialéctica que hay de la vida y la muerte, o sea, esto de que el individuo tenga que ganar su realidad, digamos, materializándose a nivel individual, pero en esa objetividad que él consigue de esta manera no pueda ganar su permanencia y pueda vivir durante un tiempo, pero luego la permanencia tenga que continuar en otro individuo que también va a morir. O sea, esto es una contradicción, y Hegel lo dice, que aquí hay unas contradicciones radicales, son desgarradoras. O sea, al final, la vida continúa viviendo a costa de lo vivo. La vida devora lo que vive. Y sin esa dialéctica de la vida y la muerte, ese ciclo vital, no puede permanecer. Entonces, siempre que en Hegel aparece una contradicción de este tipo, no hay reconciliación y no hay lo absoluto. La idea es lo absoluto porque es la unidad inmediata sujeto-objeto, pero solo en lo inmediato, porque el concepto ya le ha puesto en ese punto de partida. Es la idea inmediata. Pero cuando intenta desarrollar esa relación de sí a sí, se da cuenta de que empiezan a desplegarse contradicciones internas, porque algo falla en ese proceso, ¿no? Y a mí esto, no sé si se puede hacer la comparación. En parte creo que sí, porque Hegel dice que la vida tiene una transversalidad en el sistema muy notable. Estamos hablando de la vida en la naturaleza, pero también cabe hablar de la vida del espíritu. Incluso Hegel dice que la vida en la lógica no es exactamente ni la vida de la naturaleza ni del espíritu. O sea que es, claro, al final es el absoluto, aunque inmediato, es normal que sea transversal a todo el sistema. Entonces yo iba a hacer una comparación en el espíritu objetivo. A mí este ciclo de vida y muerte me recuerda mucho a la filosofía de la historia. En la filosofía de la historia también hay una idea que quiere ganar realidad, y es la idea de la libertad. Pero claro, también esto es muy trágico, ¿no? Porque ¿cómo se abre camino la libertad? A través del proceso histórico. Devorando todos los individuos, todos los héroes, todas las naciones, todos los estados, y al final hay algún estado que sea el paraíso. Pues al final la historia es como un viento frío que barre todas las naciones. ¿Y cómo concluye la cosa? Pues Hegel dice, bueno, esto era espíritu finito todavía. El espíritu objetivo es finito. O sea, no podemos esperar que el absoluto descienda sobre la Tierra de esta manera. Yo no absolutizaría mucho el Estado en Hegel, porque el Estado es una figura del espíritu finito. Y la filosofía de la historia, que es la transición ya al espíritu absoluto, demuestra que ningún Estado puede aspirar a hacer descender lo absoluto de esta manera. Entonces, a mí me recuerda mucho a la vida, porque la vida también, como la libertad en la historia, están dentro de este ciclo de vida y muerte. Para que viva la libertad tienen que morir los individuos y tienen que morir las naciones. Y creo que está en una contradicción parecida. Y por eso, aunque la vida creo que está un peldañito por encima, porque está en lo absoluto ya y el Estado no, están ahí un poco en la frontera los dos, ¿no? Creo que se pueden comparar, no sé cómo lo veis.
Comment on what you said, which is really interesting. I always like to trace some relations between different parts of the system. But there was a point about the genus process that you mentioned. It's a point that interests me because I've always been working the problem of contradiction. You mentioned the contradiction of the genus process. And in the word you used, my impression was that you were referring the notion of contradiction much more to the death of the individual, to the passions of the individual. But I just wanted to underline that actually Hegel uses the word of contradiction here in this passage much is related. I don't think you're wrong, okay? I think, but I think that there is another contradiction that is going on here. There are, and I mentioned the first one that he's here in the text. And he says, it is in the last page, now because the relation of genus is the identity of individual self of feeling in such a one who is at the same time another self individual, it is a contradiction. So it's referring it's using contradiction to explain what is going on in the relation between the two living individuals when each one obtain a self-fulfilling in the unity with each other. So this is the contradiction is underlining here. At the same time, I think you're right, because there is a contradictory structure also going on in the passing over in the individual into its non-being. It's the same logical structure, I think, that we were, it is underlining the finitude of the individual with respect to the genus. And this finitude is characterized by the same self-contradictory structure of finitude in the doctrine of being, I think. At the same time, if we see that same process from the perspective of the genus that feeds itself of the life and death of the individual, we have a concrete universal. And is the analysis of this concrete universal united with its own reality is not the concrete universal of the beginning. Now is the concrete universal united with, that is objectified, is united with objectivity, that is going to be analyzed, is going to be dialectically analyzed in what is coming from here in 2 weeks when we are looking, when we are analyzing the doctrine, the idea of true and of the good. There is this concrete universality, which we didn't have at the beginning, because at the beginning we had the living individual, but it was not a singularity as a concrete universality. We have singularity as a concrete universality only with the genus process, where they have all the singularity as part of the process of determination of a concrete universality, which is the genus.
Claro, pero es un poco paradójico que, ¿no?, una vida que tiene que ser la unidad de lo subjetivo y lo objetivo, que parte de ahí, al final parece que su dialéctica se reconcilia o culmina en el género. El género sí es universal y particular, ¿no? Es género más especie, pero el género no cuenta con el individuo, sino que el género vive de que los individuos pues, van pasando y van muriendo. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿qué clase de objetividad tiene el género? El género, al final, pierde la unidad sujeto-objeto. O sea, no acaba de arraigar en la objetividad más que con esos individuos que pasan, vienen, pero no son más que medios para que vienen a ser sacrificados. El género, ¿dónde va a conseguir la objetividad? En el conocer, en la idea del conocer. Pero no en la vida, o sea, sí, a ver, en la vida sí, pero es un poco paradójico. O sea, no, yo no lo veo satisfactorio, no lo veo reconciliado, lo veo muy trágico, lo veo dramático, ¿no? Que esa vida viva de la muerte de los individuos, cuando esa vida tenía que darse realidad en la objetividad. Pues, ¿qué clase de objetividad es esa? En la
I
que
got it.
no puede haber permanencia. Los
Okay.
individuos pasan y mueren, no hay permanencia en esa objetividad. Entonces yo creo que ya el género pues, va a ser la transición a la idea del conocer, donde ya ahí sí el género va a conseguir la objetividad, pero ya por el lado del conocimiento.
I think that maybe I'm older than you, so I have a better relation with tragedies and with paradox. I agree. I totally agree with you. That is paradoxical. Mm? And for Hegel, this is perfectly fine. Because it does not, in my view, is not comprehending genus as some kind of abstracted entity separated from the individual. For him, the genus is the very process of birth and death of all the individual. They are two sides of the same process. This is why this universality is concrete, because it feeds itself. It's a kind of assimilation process. The universality feeds itself of the life and death of the individual. But I think that he is asking us to see this assimilation process, this universal assimilation process, according to the dynamic of internal purposiveness, where the genus and the individual are not something different. So they are not simply instruments of means of a process which is external to them. They are the constitutive moments of this process. Without the individual, this process does not exist. This is why I think we already have a kind of a universal, concrete universality. And what he's interested to here is not the genus, natural genus process that we find in the philosophy of nature. Is asking us to think of this process in its pure structure, this pure structure of this process that he's interested to in this point of the system. And this allows the passage to something completely that seems completely different, but is not, which is the idea of true Jeff Good, because it is a development of this very structure that we find here, this concrete universality. It's in infinity that fits itself of infinite finitude, according to my reading, but don't know.
Sí, o sea, estoy de acuerdo. Obviamente el género no es algo universal abstracto, es el universal concreto. Pero una cosa es que lo universal haya producido la particularidad dentro de sí, la concreción, e incluso la individualidad, porque estamos ya dentro de un género. Entonces, así habíamos definido la individualidad, ¿no? Una particularidad que se diferencia de todas las demás dentro de un género. Entonces, eso lo tenemos. Pero tengo dudas sobre si esto significa agotar toda la objetividad. O sea, el universal es particular e incluso individual en el género, vale, sí. Pero la objetividad no puede, no falta objetividad todavía. ¿No falta todavía la existencia concreta?
I
No lo
don't know
sé,
if
me
you get the
pregunto.
question.
No lo
You
sé,
are,
la verdad no tengo respuesta, pero siempre que hay una contradicción o algo paradójico o algo trágico, no hay la perfecta reconciliación. Y la idea quiere ser la unidad del sujeto y el objeto perfectamente reconciliados. La contradicción va a mover el proceso hasta que se resuelva, pero si hay contradicción, todavía no se ha resuelto. Entonces yo me pregunto, ¿qué falta? Tiene que faltar algo.
Okay.
Y quizá, pues este universal concreto, que se ha dado particularidad en sí mismo, todavía no ha agotado toda la objetividad. ¿Y dónde creo que veo yo eso? Pues en que los individuos empíricos mueren, tienen que morir, no pueden preservar su realidad en la objetividad. Y eso
I
creo
think
que
that
todavía...
I think that the fact that each living individual dies or pass over into his non-being is part of the objectivity. It is a constitutive part of the objectivity.
Ujú.
And but I think now I understanding why I was not understanding your question. I think that is depend on maybe a difference on our view of contradiction in what is going on here in idea, because you seem from what you said. My impression is that when I have a contradiction, I don't have a reconciliation. I think that Hegel's challenge here is to show that the true reconciliation is a reconciliation that includes the radical opposition in itself. And this is exactly what I find in idea. It says that at the beginning of the section, idea is something that has the radical opposition within itself. And when I lose this radical opposition, I don't have life anymore. When I lose this radical opposition, contradiction, I have death. And so I lose objectivity. It is
Yo
when
creo que
I
esa-
lose this opposition that I lose the objectivity, because the objectivity is built, is constituted by living processes all the time. Living processes that involves mechanical, chemical, teleological processes, and so on.
y no será, a ver, sin esa contradicción, obviamente no tenemos la vida, pero la vida en sentido biológico, en sentido natural, pero es que la vida es más, va más allá. Yo no creo que este problema de que el género tenga que continuar en individuos externos mutuamente, es decir, como le ocurre al árbol, ¿no? Que esta imagen es, creo que es en la filosofía de la historia donde lo dice Hegel, ¿no? El árbol, para continuar, tiene que producir una semilla que cae fuera de sí. La semilla va a producir otro individuo, pero ese individuo, siendo el mismo, no es el mismo. El fruto cae fuera. Y eso Hegel lo dice con tono trágico, o sea, lo dice como si fuera algo que en la naturaleza no se puede arreglar. La naturaleza está en la forma de la exterioridad y esa es su limitación, pero que en el espíritu sí se va a arreglar, porque la vida es
Mhm.
más. En Hegel, la vida por antonomasia es la vida del espíritu. Y creo que en este punto estamos pensando por los ejemplos que pone Hegel, ¿no? Bueno, sí, estamos pensando en una vida muy biológica, pero que el concepto de vida va más allá y yo tengo dudas sobre si realmente esta contradicción, si profundizamos en otras dimensiones de la vida, no se reconcilia. Incluso en la propia religión el concepto de vida es importantísimo. El Dios cristiano es un Dios viviente y
Mhm.
el despliegue de la divinidad es una historia de un Dios viviente que se despliega en el tiempo como si fuera también un individuo vivo que pasa por sus fases, el Padre, el Hijo, el Espíritu. Realmente en la religión que Hegel considera la consumada hay una idea del despliegue divino como un organismo. Y ahí se reconcilian muchas cosas. Al Dios del cristianismo no le pasa como al árbol, que tiene que dejar el
No,
fruto
pero
fuera.
no entendí. ¿Al Dios del cristianismo?
Sí. No le ocurre como al árbol, como al individuo biológico
Ah,
que no está obligado a continuar en otro que no es él. O sea, a Hegel yo sé que le interesa mucho esta paradoja, pero ¿por qué? Pero no porque vea en ella lo absoluto, sino porque ve el motor para una reconciliación que va a traer lo absoluto. Y
mhm,
Hegel, claro que ahonda mucho en las contradicciones, pero no creo que las absolutice, sino que las toma como el motor de una dialéctica que nos va a elevar a lo absoluto.
mhm.
Entonces, para ver cómo esas contradicciones se reconcilian, creo que había que ir más allá de la vida biológica y explorar otras dimensiones de la vida que están en el espíritu, incluso en el espíritu absoluto. La idea del amor que tú has mencionado, yo creo que donde cabe, porque en algún momento, no sé si entendí muy bien, pero relacionabas la vida con el amor, por la relación con el otro. Bueno, a ver, la relación con el otro, no sé si es una relación de sujeto a objeto, sino una relación entre dos sujetos. Eso sería lo primero. Y el amor, o sea, una relación intersubjetiva. Y el amor, yo creo que el lugar donde Hegel lo trata es la religión, no es la vida biológica. En la vida biológica hay relación sexual, eso sí. Y la relación sexual sí que es tomar a otro como objeto, es tomarlo como medio para yo poner mi semilla y continuar en un otro que no soy yo. Ahí sí que estoy objetivando al otro, en la relación sexual. Pero el amor, en la esfera del espíritu, y su lugar para esto es la religión, eh, ha reconciliado ya toda esta tragedia. Ya no le pasa esto.
Thank you so much for the observation. I would like to say three things about 3 points that you mentioned. First, we completely agree, of course, on this idea of contradiction as the moving principle. And I think this is our meeting point because at least we can close this because this problem is huge. But on this point, of course, we completely agree. You mentioned that I'm not sure I understood what you were saying. My impression is that you were saying something like, okay, here in the logical idea of life, it seems to have as reference more the biological life than other kinds of life. And I think that you are right. And it's not by chance. It's interesting that at the very end of the notion of life, of the logical idea of life, when he's talking about the genus process and the concrete universality that is the genus, that is realized through the structure of the sexual relation. Here is not talking about nature, but he's referring to it, to this phenomenon. He mentioned the word spirit, but it's in the last lines when he's making the transition to the idea of the true and to the idea of good. He says,
Okay.
in copulation, the immediacy of living individuality perishes, as you underlined. The death of this life, of this kind of life structure, is the coming to be of spirit. Include the word spirit. And these, I think, go towards your observation about the relation between the logical idea of life and the transition and what is going to happen in the next section. About love, I think that what is going on here is not really related with this systematic treatment of love. I related it to the to that passage in the early writings. And in the early writings, my impression is that the words life and love a lot of time goes together. They goes together. Because he don't have already a theory of love, he don't have already a theory of love properly disinvolved. And of course, the proper treatment of the notion of love. I don't know the passage, what you mentioned about religion. I don't remember it, honestly. What I have in mind is his treatment on love in the family section in the philosophy of right. Of course, we have a dynamic between the two lovers, which has a basic dynamic, what is going here too, because for him also the natural part of the love relation, and so the sexual relation is a necessary condition in order to have a love relation, but it is not all we can say about love.
Tiene razón en que los escritos de juventud, las ideas de vida y de amor son muy similares, pero yo tengo dudas de si la vida a la que se está refiriendo y Hegel es la biológica, porque el joven Hegel estaba obsesionado con la religión.
Sí.
Estaba obsesionado, realmente cuando habla de la vida en los escritos de juventud, seguro, casi seguro se está refiriendo a la vida del espíritu. Y por eso se parecen.
I think we need another seminar on the early teleological writing,
Sí.
and I would totally join you if you in the next week, because I'm not sure. I mean, there are a lot of discussion going on there, starting from the title of that writings, right? They were understood mainly as theological, but then there was a huge discussion about the possibility to eliminate the theological from the title there, because it is talking about religion, but probably not only about this. It's the huge problem is it's Vayung, I don't even know how to say that in English, between objectivity and subjectivity, and then we go back to what we are talking here in life. Oh, how curious is that?
Muy bien,
Ok.
muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Miquela, por la exposición y la participación y las preguntas. Muchas gracias. Y bueno, ahora ya no tenemos tiempo, vamos a cerrar aquí la sesión. También les agradecemos a Javier y a Zaida por las preguntas y los invitamos a la siguiente sesión en 2 semanas para la idea del conocer y seguir con la discusión. Entonces, muchas gracias y nos vemos en 2 semanas.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Un
Chao,
placer.
nos vemos.
Chao, chao.